BYD cutting prices on close to dozens of EV models in China's market and by up to 30%. Can Australian consumers expect deep discounts too?
Oh, hopefully, yes, they can, but not anytime soon, unfortunately. I think it's going to take a while to flow through to the market.
Why is that?
Um, well, look, I think in China, there is just this huge amount of competition. It's the world's biggest car market. It's the world's biggest EV market. There's intense competition from a whole bunch of different car makers, and the prices of battery storage are coming down, and that's a lot of that's made in China. In Australia, we just don't have the level of competition yet, and we just don't have the level of demand for electric vehicles. Hopefully, the new policies from the federal government that'll come into place from July the 1st will intensify that competition. To what extent we see those discounts passed on to Australia, we're starting to see a few of them, but not to the extent that you're seeing in China.
BYD sales in Australia during the month of April eclipsed those of Tesla. Despite security concerns associated with Chinese EVs, are Australians beginning to favour electric vehicles from that country?
Because, yeah, China's sales are growing in Australia. It's a bit of a hard ask because a lot of the brands are just not familiar to people. So people have sort of grown up with all those European and American and Australian brands that they're used to. So Chinese brands are harder to ask, but BYD have made an inroad into the Australian market. Now, that one in April might have been a one-off because Tesla was sort of impacted by logistical issues and they're waiting for a couple of ships to arrive and things like that, although their sales have been down quite sharply this year. So we'll wait and see what happens in the month of May, June, and July. But look, I think Tesla used to dominate the Australian market with more than 50% in Australia. Now they're down to around 25, 30%. So that increased competition is an interesting thing, and it's probably a good thing.
We know that Tesla's sales came under pressure here after Elon Musk took on the Doge responsibilities at the direction of Donald Trump. Do you think Australians are beginning to abandon Tesla?
Look, I think there's been some of that to a certain extent. Look, there's been multiple reasons for the Tesla falls. One is the logistical problems. I mentioned there was a retooling in the factory for the new Model Y, the refresh Model Y. And there's some people would have been waiting for that new model to come. But there's quite clearly there has been some pushback against Elon Musk. There's all sorts of surveys come out in America and in Canada and Europe about the damage that that's done to the brand. In Australia, you think it's probably less impactful than in those countries. In Canada and Germany, for instance, it's been really harsh, but I do think there's some impact. I mean, I know people who've decided to change their minds about buying Tesla vehicles. It's quite clearly having an impact. To what extent, we don't know. And we also don't know to what extent that market might be replaced by the people who really like what he's done.
Now, I'm wondering about the impact that Donald Trump's tariffs have had on China's car market. Have there been any, or is it just simply too early to tell?
Well, the Chinese car market, and one of the reasons why they're having huge amounts of discounting at the moment is that they basically have no outlets. So they basically they can't get into the US market. They've got restrictions on the European market, which means that's pretty small for them. They like the Australian market. Maybe they can't get into the Australian market. Maybe there'll be discounts here. But there's this huge fight in China at the moment for market dominance. And it's kind of what we saw about a decade ago with the solar industry. If you thought about those huge solar companies which emerged at the time, and there was this massive price war and discounting, they all built up their manufacturing capacity. Then they had to compete with each other. A lot of them went bust. But then we ended up with really low cost solar panels, which came eventually to benefit Australia and the rest of the world. So we might be seeing the same thing with electric vehicles. And even if you go back to, say, a century ago in the US, when Ford was still was rolling out for the first time its manufacturing plants, there were hundreds of different little car makers at the time. Everyone sort of thought they saw an entry into the market. Oh, we can do this, we can do this. In the end, there was price war, there was competition. Some fell by the wayside, and the market ended up being dominated by four really big players. And now they're down to two or three. But that's kind of the way the market goes. But I think if we see with EVs, and particularly with battery costs, the same thing that we saw with solar, and many people think that that did happen, that will happen, then I think we'll see the benefits, hopefully, in a couple of years' time.
And so, in terms of China's market, do you expect that we are about to see some consolidation from the brands there? And if yes, which brands are likely most at risk?
Look, it's hard to say from here, but there's been a lot of squealing about the price cuts announced by BYD over the last week or 2 weeks. There's been a lot of companies which have seen their share prices fall, including BYD, but BYD is kind of like the big daddy of them all, so it might be able to afford to do that. Look, it's really hard to tell which ones might be most vulnerable. I guess the ones that are squealing loudest are probably the ones that and shouting loudest about it at the moment, because they're the ones that probably feel they're more vulnerable, have a smaller market share, don't have the deep pockets, and might themselves falling by the wayside or bought out by their big competitors.
Giles Parkinson, great to speak to you.
Thank you.